Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending our webinar, IT Equipment and Service Agreement, Contractual Pitfalls and How to Avoid Them. A few things to get us started for today. All of your telephone lines are muted. On the top of your screen, there's a Q&A button. During the webinar, if you'd like to ask the presenter a question, please submit your questions using the Q&A function. Richard will do his best to answer all questions during or at the conclusion of the webinar. We have quite a few attendees registered today, so if your question isn't answered, we will follow up with you after the webinar via email. We are offering CLE credits for this webinar. CLE certificates and a copy of the PowerPoint will be emailed to all attendees next week. And now for our webinar. Information technology equipment and services are rapidly becoming critical to every aspect of a public entity's daily operation. From providing free Wi-Fi in downtown areas, to upgrading a police department's dispatch system, as well as creating large-scale systems for public records data retention and enhancing a city's fiber optic network to provide ultra-high-speed internet use for businesses. Public scrutiny of an agency's purchase and implementation of IT equipment and services is very high because of the cost and public interest. And members of the community often directly use the equipment and services, or it directly affects their health and safety, such as in vehicle communication systems for fire protection services. Meredith Nave Principal Rich Pierota will provide real-life examples of a variety of IT services agreements that he has negotiated on behalf of cities and special districts. He will explain the primary areas of contractual risk and share advice on best practices for addressing each one. Richard is an experienced advice and transactional attorney who has been practicing municipal and special district law for over 15 years. He specializes in municipal governance, education law, public contracts, procurement and construction delivery methods, land use, and real estate. Rich also advises clients on issues that involve ethics and conflicts of interest, financial fraud, cannabis regulation, project labor agreements, and information technology contracts. Thank you, Rich, for being here with us today.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar. Hopefully you're enjoying your lunch. This is definitely one of those lunchtime webinars, so hopefully in between bites you're able to issue spot, maybe hear something that will jog a memory or prompt you to think about what this webinar was about, and maybe even cause you to think about me in the future when you're considering IT agreement negotiations. And we'll talk about in this webinar why, as public agency counsel and staff, you need to care about these particular issues. And you probably already do because you're on the webinar, but I'll tell you a little bit more about why that is. We'll talk about the cloud and cloud computing and do a little primer on that, not knowing everyone's specific experience with these types of agreements and negotiating these types of agreements. I'll start from a pretty macro level, and then we'll go into the detailed level towards the end on some specific things that I've noticed, observations, best practices that I've learned and experienced negotiating many of these agreements for many different types of vendors, including large account resellers. And again, we'll talk a little bit specifically about key contract negotiating points. And of course, this is where I put the disclaimer that I'm not providing anyone legal advice in this particular webinar. I'm just going to be presenting to you all best practices that I've seen, observations that I've made and had regarding negotiating and reviewing many of these agreements here at Myers-Nave, and how they've developed in the last several years related to the growth of cloud computing. I want to also, just a little advertisement, this is the first in a series, I'm guessing, that I'm going to be doing regarding IT-related contracts. I'll be doing a webinar and developing a webinar also on dark fiber broadband networking contracts and small cell site lease agreements. So look out for that webinar coming soon, and be developing that shortly. So let's just jump right into the webinar as to why you as public agency counsel and staff should be caring about this at this point in time. And I'll give you sort of the big warning, and you probably already know about it because it's been law for a couple of years, but under California Civil Code Section 1798.29, if there is a data breach that is suffered by the public agency, you have certain requirements that are imposed upon you by the Civil Code section. And I don't know that many clients that have had to do a data breach notification. I have had to advise specific clients on how to do data breach notifications, and it's not fun, and it's not a great experience to tell people that they've had a data breach because of something that may have happened related to your IT work, IT departments, or IT vendors. And again, speaking you as in public agencies, I think most of you are public agency or public agency counsel on this call. What do you have to do? You have to provide notice of the data breach, what happened, what information was involved, what the public agency is going to be doing about it, what you as a consumer or you who was subject to the data breach can do, and of course, contact information at the public agency for more information. If over 500 Californians were subject to the data breach, and if you're a public agency, that's probably what is going to happen, you also have to provide this breach disclosure to the California Attorney General. That's no fun either. And in addition to any damages that may be proven attributable to the public agency or any injunctions that may be filed related to the public agency's data breach, the statute provides that there may be at least $2,500 in liquidated damages in addition to those damages against the public agency related to the data breach. So I'm here to tell you that this is no joke and it's serious, and it could be happening because those who are out there to get information, including private information of individuals, are targeting public agencies. I'm talking about those who are hackers, those who may have even more nefarious reasons to access user information that is held by public agencies. What kinds of data are you holding as a public agency? Well, of course, you may be holding personal information, and hopefully you know what you're collecting or what your agencies are collecting as far as personal information of those who are participating, interacting with, or working with your public agency, your clients. Social Security numbers, for example. Well, California driver's license is probably more common. Of course, credit or debit card numbers for everything from paying parking tickets to paying for business license to paying for planning application work. You're probably collecting credit or debit card information. Medical information, especially for those, I noticed that there are a couple who are from counties. You may be collecting medical information or health insurance information. Likewise, for my city clients and public agency clients, you have your staff, your employees. You do have their health insurance information, medical information. So we're not just talking about those who are interacting, your residents, businesses, those who interact with cities and counties and special districts on a daily basis. We're also talking about the individuals who work for your agencies and how they are the end users and what kinds of personal data are you holding of theirs. Let's break it down even more, because as we think about this as public agency counsel and staff, of course, we just talked about, do you accept credit or debit cards for bill payments? This is coming across many of my clients. Are you vetting cannabis operators? Are you auditing cannabis dispensary finances and operations, especially to ensure that they're making tax payments properly? Will you be doing so? Of course, staff, especially finance department staff or those who are in a cannabis department within my client cities, are already thinking about this, and how are we going to ensure that our taxes, our tax information about tax payments is coming in and it's truthful and it's being vetted properly? Well, we're going to need to see some information, and more likely than not, you are able to access as much information as you can, or wanting to access as much information as you can from your cannabis dispensary operators, possibly even including medical or patient information, in order to ensure you're receiving those tax payments. Are you thinking about that? Then we have this other sort of area, or did you create, or did your client create an app for code enforcement complaints? Or did they create an app for something else? I have clients who are definitely creating or working with companies to create apps to help residents and businesses interact on mobile devices with the city in ways that are innovative, exciting, but also create these types of issues we have to start thinking about. Let's talk about it a little bit of a macro level, and we'll talk about the last 50 years and thinking about how computing and computing contracts were done. Think about it from that you had a mainframe computer. It was a proprietary, probably a large computer with a mainframe that was housed on your premises that handled all your computing needs and computation. That moved to a client-server environment, which shrunk the mainframe a little bit, but still created this proprietary on-site system that you, the public agency, managed. Gradually, that morphed into web services, and this is where we started seeing the migration towards outsourced server systems and outsourced handling of your data and information that was obviously cheaper, saved on space and energy costs, and was touted as the next big thing. Fast forward that to where we are today and the future to come, and where virtualization is just an extension of what those web services were, whereas virtualization was shrinking things down even smaller to make it even more efficient and virtualizing the servers and creating these server farms that you farmed everything to, and you didn't have the large client servers on site anymore. You didn't have the mainframe computers. Everything was migrating to what is now the cloud, which is a dispersed array of servers that are across jurisdictions, across even maybe states, maybe even countries, that handle your data and services. And everything is done virtually. Let's talk about this in the context of what now we're going to start breaking it down even more into what these agreements generally are. And we're going to primarily talk about SaaS agreements, which is software as a service, because the primary end users are most likely who you're dealing with and who you're negotiating these contracts for. Your end users are your employees or residents and those who receive services. And these would be your customer relationship management software, social media, of course, your email providers, and your virtual desktops. Then it's possible that you may be negotiating agreements with app developers. Like I said before, are you creating apps, or are you hiring companies to create apps for your city to provide services? Does it involve providing web servers, databases, and development tools? And that may be happening as well. And finally, there's infrastructure as a service. And is your entity, is the public agency involved in actually distributed networking, providing storage, virtual machines, and servers for other public agents possibly? And we're talking about large organizations in that case. But primarily what we're going to be talking about today is SaaS, or SaaS, software as a service, and probably what you're dealing with most often from either on a day-to-day basis, a week-to-week basis, or month-to-month. So what does that mean? Your SaaS vendor is managing all of these things. They're managing your applications. They're managing your data, your runtime, all the middleware that may be involved in that, the servers, the storage, the network, and the networking and the operating system, but not on site. It's not happening within your offices. Who are your vendor and who are we talking about? We're probably talking about Microsoft, Office 365. Most public agencies are contracting with them. You're talking about LinkedIn. For your distributed software, some agencies may be using Gmail by Google or contracting with resellers or large account resellers that use Google, and maybe you're migrating to use Gmail in your organization, or something like GoToMeeting. These are your companies where you're dealing with a large account reseller or some type of vendor who are selling this suite of products. Some may be using private cloud computing, which is very interesting. I'll just talk about this real briefly. It's where it's obviously it's hosted at a service provider site. You've got a dedicated company, a dedicated reseller or consultant that supports you. You're the one client. You're the customer. And that means that they're not utilizing a shared infrastructure. And the connectivity is dedicated. It's proprietary. And that means that they're using a dedicated fiber or an internet connection or some other private network to manage your data and retain it. Of course, this provides a high level of security. We're not primarily talking about this, but the negotiation with your private cloud computing company isn't going to be that much different from what you're going to be doing with your public cloud computing company. The reason I say that is because most agencies I'm seeing now are using this, public cloud computing, where it's hosted at the service provider's site, the vendor's site. They're supporting not just you, but multiple clients who may not all be public agencies. They're using shared infrastructure, which means that it cuts down on costs to you and to all their other clients. And that means that the support and the information exchange is done over the internet. It's well suited for information that is not necessarily sensitive. But what does that mean for public agencies? What I said before, that personal information, if there's a data breach, just like from companies in California, there has to be a notification of that data breach, and data breaches are happening. And of course, though, we're doing this all because it's less expensive than using a private cloud computing provider. So you're probably used to doing this, and I am too. Traditional IT outsourcing was done the old way, where there was a custom-built solution. I'm going back to that historical slide where we had mainframe to web services. You were using custom-built solutions that met specific requirements of the public agency, that you had specific specs that maybe were provided by a consultant that then were put out into the market in an RFP of some kind. That led to a highly negotiated contract where you had a long due diligence and negotiation life cycle with this particular vendor that provided you everything, not only the IT equipment, the peripherals, we're talking about the CPUs and the monitors and the keyboards and the printer, but also all of the operating system and the support that came with it. Each transaction then was unique. There was a responsibility allocation. There was a scope, and there were deliverables. Deliver the product at a certain date and time, deliver services, make sure the OS, the operating system, was operating and was operating according to these specific timeframes and milestones. Maybe there was beta involved. There were beta versions that allowed you to get through the bugs and then eventually to a product, maybe a financial management product or your payroll product or your payroll system or function that was scoped and provided through deliverables. There were certain service levels that you expected would be provided by this company. And then there was clear financials. There was pricing. There was clear profitability for the vendor or for the provider. Costs were generally known. Investments were put in. And then there was a transfer. That was the old way of doing things. We all did it that way. I did it that way for many different products and for many different clients, and primarily in the financial context, where they needed financial reporting software. They needed payroll software that crossed over with the financial reporting software. Maybe you were using, at the time, was EMC, or was it SAP? Now, you're moving towards cloud services. And this is what we're seeing, and I'm seeing day to day, week to week, cloud services and cloud cloud contracts and cloud negotiations. Standardized solutions that are based on a predefined platform and application. And this is characterized by what? On-demand self-service and a broad network access, which means that there's resource pooling amongst multiple clients by this vendor and rapid elasticity, which means that they can expand and contract the suite of services that they can provide to particular clients, including you, public agency, that meets your needs. And they can do it more rapidly. So the standard offerings, they're going to say, are not negotiable because they can't change them for you specifically, public agency. They're providing a suite of things that meet a lot of different clients' needs that are similar to you. What does that mean for you, though? That also means that you get the best of the latest industry technology but not necessarily to your individual customer requirements. But then it's moving again towards standardization and standardization of processes. And that means there's a standard contract document for those service offerings. I'm probably telling you what you already know and have already seen and are now having to deal with. Why is it migrating this way? It's pretty obvious. There's no infrastructure management anymore. You don't need that large dedicated group of people to be handling an IT solution or multiple IT solutions within the same organization. There's reduced operational management, again, saving costs. There's a rapid implementation and deployment. When changes need to occur, when technology upgrades, or there needs a new version needs to be upgraded, or more likely, security services or security requirements need to be upgraded quickly because of rapidly changing environment out there related to data breaches, there's an ability to provide implementation and deployment quickly. And that's what agencies want, and that's what clients want. Again, big important point, lower upfront total cost. That's where we're going, and that's why it's migrating that way. But it also provides elasticity and scalability that's almost on demand. And it's exciting, and it's fast, and you need to be able to keep up, and that's what the agreements need to be able to do. There's an argument that there's reduced IT complexity, but I'm going to say that the complexity is just shifted to a different part, and you're probably experiencing this as well. Like I said before, there's an industry-leading technology and innovation. It allows the vendors to sell to you and react with the software providers like the Microsofts, like the Googles, with information about how they can innovate and make changes quickly. It does mean that there is a security by default. Again, standardization means sometimes standardization of security, and we'll talk about that some more because security is obviously the most important thing we need to think about as public agencies. There's an ability to manage and mine big data, and whatever side of the aisle you fall on how you feel about that, it is very important, again, towards the vendors and the suppliers providing industry-leading technology and innovation. And then finally, and this is probably the most important point I'm seeing today, is that there's the emergence of bring your own device, BYOD. It leverages the ubiquity of mobile devices, the ability to bring your iPad, to bring your Microsoft Surface or your Chromebook, and have it interact with your system as seamlessly and quickly as possible. Let's start talking about the SaaS contract and the scope of the SaaS contract. This contract scope is usually based, like I said, on standardized solutions, probably things you've already seen. It's then reflected in a standard service document and contract that includes standard optional capabilities, features, and functions. That's what your reseller is sending to you and providing to you. It's efficient for them. They can send it out to multiple clients and figure out what fits best amongst a suite of clients, including public agencies. That means that there's a service description or service specs rather than what you've seen before, which was a statement of work that goes back to the old way of doing things, which was a statement of work that had clear and defined deliverables, milestones, etc. And then the all-important, and we'll talk about this more later, service level agreement, which is where most of the negotiation is probably going to happen regarding how performance is supposed to be measured, and we'll talk about that later in the webinar. I make this slide because this probably will look familiar to a lot of you because you joined the webinar to figure out, maybe this is why I need to join this webinar, is to figure out what they're talking about when we talk about policies. Service scope is described usually in a single document through policies. And my argument is that the use of the word policies has been a way to knock down negotiation. We all used to the word policy, and policies maybe are hard to address, hard to change, because there has to be a process that is gone through in order to change a policy. But that just means to me that you need to read these carefully, and these are definitely negotiable. There's a service level objective, and these policies encompass change management, support, the termination policy, the system resiliency, and disaster recovery service policy. There's, of course, the security policy and the privacy policy. And these service descriptions, they're going to define the management process, the quantity of the system resources that are being provided to you, and your obligations. So they're putting your obligations into their policy. Think about that, and don't be dissuaded by the word policy that is not negotiable. They are absolutely negotiable. I think it's a strategy, obviously, to keep things moving quickly so that adoption can be had. You've got the service, you get things started. Our job is to make sure that people are thinking about these deliverables and these contracts in a way that protects the public agency and ultimately the end users. Other terms and documents or policies you're probably going to see. The application's features may be described, and I'm going to say most likely are going to be described in separate product documentation, which is going to be highly technical. And the application features may be features that, yes, of course, you want to be looking for, but they're going to be put in a way that is standard for the product documentation language. The professional services may be required, and that's good. You may want professional services to set up and configure the services and the service suite that you're buying and ordering, but that may be done and probably should be done by a separate statement of work. And these policies are going to say that they're subject to change, and the services are subject to modification. And those modifications are to reflect changes that the vendor and, by extension, the software provider need to make related to infrastructure. Security, obviously, like I said before, is a big deal, and they're going to be constantly changing and updating security to meet the latest security threats. Technical configurations that they need to make updates and version updates, and of course, the features may change and should change. And those cloud policies are going to say that they're subject to change in order to address all of those things. What we need to make sure is that changes generally should not result in a material reduction in performance or the availability of the service. We'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation. What are the terms of this agreement? And I want to point to this slide. I'm going to come back to the slide throughout the rest of the presentation because it's important. The duration of cloud services is based on a defined and finite term. You may have seen in the past you negotiated these long IT agreements that were maybe pretty long and maybe even had a perpetual sort of license or agreement with them because you were locked in to using that particular provider. They provided the whole menu and suite. I'm thinking of PeopleSoft. I'm thinking of old companies like, again, EMC, SAP now, even did. They had a perpetual license. That's not the case anymore. These are now month to month for certain services. There may be a minimum period for more complex cloud services, but the more standard, Office 365 and others, it's not a perpetual license. It's based on a defined term. That's a change. What does that mean from an accounting standpoint, too? And this is one of those best practices or observations I've seen, is that what's happening is that is there authorization from an internal control standpoint, from an accounting standpoint, to enter into these finite term agreements because they're going to be extended into the future 2 or 3 years. You need them, and you need to have them renew automatically, or if they're not going to be renewed automatically, then they need to be approved every single year. And that, from a administrative burden standpoint, you need to start considering and thinking about, because auto renewal may apply, and some of us may be wary of auto renewal in most of our contracts, but that's what may apply in these cases. You want to look at the term of the agreement very carefully to see and make sure that your accounting practices line up with the renewal terms. And I only say that because of experience and seeing that happen with clients. Oh my gosh, we need to go back to the city council for a renewal because we don't have enough in the budget, or the amount is greater than we expected on this renewal. And if we don't do it by the certain date, they're going to cut us off. That's the problem that I've seen most immediately. Okay, halfway through the presentation, and we get to the most important part, in my opinion, because it goes back to that civil code section, which is data security. And I'm probably going to be telling you things that are not different or not, this is not groundbreaking. The contract is not a substitute for due diligence of the cloud provider. the large account reseller you may be dealing with, how long have they been in business, the responsibility for security and privacy related to data breach and data safety compliance cannot be outsourced to a service provider. It is on you, public agency, and I think we all know that. What does that mean? Conduct appropriate due diligence and selection of those large account resellers, those service providers that are helping you decide which suite of services from Google, from Microsoft, from et cetera, you need. Then you also need to ensure that security standards are reflected in your contractual clauses. I'll go to that in the next couple of slides. And finally, monitoring the performance of your service providers to those security standards is important, but of course to the entire contract is important. And hopefully your IT department, that's their job, that's what they're doing, but you as the attorneys need to be aware that that is job one for the public agency. And be prepared if things go sideways. And I've dealt with everything from large account resellers going bankrupt and leaving data in the successor in their successor company's hands, and us not having contact information, to applications to companies being bought and sold very quickly and having to transition agreements. We need to pay attention. Security standards, real quick. Your scope of services should include a framework for security and describe applicable security practices. And I'm now speaking more towards the IT folks on the call. The attorneys, you need to be aware that we need to describe the technical or organizational or administrative controls used by the service provider to deliver the services. And the data center operations may align to these particular standards. What are they? Your service providers can demonstrate adequacy of controls and safeguards for hosting and processing your data through recognized auditing standards. And these should be in your agreement. SSAE 16, statements on standards for attestation engagements, or an international standard. Either one is fine. But don't use SAS 70. This is a statement on auditing standards number 70 is no longer a current auditing standard. If that's in an agreement that you're looking at or may have just approved, you may want to try to amend that agreement or amend that agreement to go with one of the other standards, specifically SSAE 16. Let's talk about best practices that I've observed and seen. And this is not an exhaustive list, and it's a little bit of a laundry list, but what I'm looking for and what hopefully you're looking at are the physical controls of the system. Are they logical? Are they logical controls, and are the physical controls logical? That's important. What does that mean? That means that, and I'll go through it as an example for the other points here. Is encryption, masking, and data anonymization, are they happening? Are they being done? Is encryption done to the latest standard? Account access, authentication, and access controls. Is there a policy or procedure that is logical, that's physically logical, and let's just call it what it is, mentally logical? Is account access controlled by 1, 2 people in your IT department? As in, do they have the ability to say no to account access? Do they control the access? How are passwords done? Is there two-factor authentication? Are passwords changed? From a physical control standpoint, are there controls on the actual computers themselves that turn them off or black them out within 1 or 2 minutes so that when someone steps away from the computer, no one can go ahead and see what they were working on? But they have to touch, and instead it has to go to a password screen. Is there two-factor authentication from that password screen once it's been blacked out? That's what I'm talking about. Physical, logical controls related to data security on site, especially for employees. Again, password control. Are passwords updated? Are they sufficiently complicated? Are they sufficiently different from the last 5 that were used? Network security and intrusion detection. Are there controls for network security and detecting whether intrusion has occurred? I would argue that check marks 3 and 4 from an end user standpoint are the most important and the most important and the most I don't want to call it abused, but the most, I guess, not thought of as important, in that passwords, how many people use the same password for every single thing that they do? How many use the same password for their Gmail account as they use for their work account? Think about that for a second, and think about how dangerous that could be and how hackers are out there already knowing that and attacking that. Data retention, backup, and recovery, very, very important. Is there a protocol, or is your data security internal controls ready for data retention, backup, and recovery if there's a catastrophic meltdown? Is there an incident response plan if there is a network security breach or intrusion? When do you produce, again, versus non-production instances? And again, for the attorneys, when there is a request for production in litigation versus a California Public Records Act request. When do you provide, when is data security supposed to scale down and allow access so that it's more expedient, for example, for requesters to review items on the computer or provide them access to data or records that are on city systems versus instances where you shouldn't do that? When do you do litigation holds, et cetera? Watching out for use of subcontractors by the cloud provider. You want to make sure that the same data security requirements and standards are applicable to the subcontractors of your large account resellers if they're using subcontractors. Security certifications, again, an important concept and piece to encryption, masking, and data anonymization. And finally, audits. Ability to audit the data security and having experts available to you, whether as consultants or on staff, to assist with that, to do spot audits if you want to do that related to your data security practices. More best practices that I observed. Recognize that the data privacy laws, the California Code, do not allocate commercial responsibility or liability. It's just notification related to the data breach. What does that mean? We need to look at the indemnification, the limitation of liability that may be part of the negotiation, and the comparative negligence concept in this regard. We'll talk about that here in the last part of the presentation. Limitations of liability. This is probably where you're running into the contract reseller, large account reseller, or the vendor. They are not going to accept consequential damages liability. They're just not. What are consequential damages for the non-attorneys out there? It's the foreseeable financial damages arising from the breach, which may greatly exceed the amount that you, the public agency, paid and the vendor received. Lost business or profit is what we're typically talking about. Why would this be the case? Of course, if the SaaS vendor accepted full consequential damages liability, a single data breach affecting one customer is going to put them out of business. You're not going to get, more often than not, you're not going to get consequential damages liability. What should you negotiate then? We're in the business of trying to get the best deal possible for our public agencies, but the attorneys, of course, are trying to protect the public agency from the consequences of a data breach and the damages and the injunctions and the costs that may accrue from that. Persuade your vendor to accept liability for direct damages from a data breach. Again, talking to the attorneys in the room, totally obvious that you want to, well, if you're not going to be responsible for the consequential damages, at least be responsible for the direct damages from the data breach itself. Of course, we can agree up to an agreed upon limit. We can find what that is. Base it on the overall value of the contract or a multiple. Maybe 1.5 or 2 times what the vendors expect to be paid over an agreed upon time period. It is not unreasonable to expect that the vendor accepts some consequential damages liability if it's involving their gross negligence or intentional misconduct. You can get that back in there if you really want to negotiate consequential damages liability. Most importantly, for my clients that I've been advising them, and especially for those who are in joint risk management pools, is that cyber liability insurance should definitely be considered as part of the engagement. Cyber liability insurance is available to protect against these risks, which a party is unable to contractually allocate to the other side. Very, very important. Again, thinking about risk management, the 3 prongs of risk management: cyber liability, indemnification, additional insured endorsements. cyber liability insurance should be included if you're going to be requiring a CGL or commercial general liability coverage, automobile liability coverage, maybe even professional errors and omissions if they're going to be providing consulting services. Cyber liability insurance is also important, and you can get it, and they can get it. They can obtain it. It's out there. Let's talk about indemnification in these agreements now. Remember the three-pronged approach. We're talking about the cyber liability insurance, the limitation liabilities out there, but indemnification. Remember to focus on the third-party claims that may be brought against you as a public agency. That means that the risks are going to be different depending on the SaaS contract or service. It's not the risk from the provider. It's not the risk from the large account reseller that's the risk. It's the risk from the third parties that may bring a claim against the public agency. That means that maybe the indemnity could be narrowed against the SaaS contract or large account reseller because you're really not, the indemnification is not really about them. You want indemnification for third-party claims. Focus again then on the allegation, not who is at fault. Not caused by the large account reseller, but related to or arising out of the contract. And that's generally what you're going to be looking for, want to have in your indemnification provision related to these contracts. What about uptime commitment? What does that mean? You as the customer from the large account reseller or the vendor have a reasonable expectation that the application should be available and usable to the same degree as if it was installed on your premises when you had the old type of system, when you had the old way of doing things. What does that mean? They should agree to make the application available and accessible at least 99.5% of the time, 24/7, 365. Remember, they're not hosting it. It's not happening. Computations, service, the servers, the data storage is not happening in City Hall. It's not happening in the basement of City Hall. It's not happening on your servers. It's happening out there in the cloud, distributed amongst multiple servers in a server warehouse that's being shared by multiple other clients that may or may not be public agencies. So you should expect this commitment, though, to be subject to, on the condition of routine maintenance outages, but only during non-peak usage hours, and events that are outside of the vendor's control, such as if the entire internet goes down, or equipment failures that are not within the vendor's environment. So what can you negotiate regarding uptime? What I've seen and what I've experienced, what I've done. Obligate the vendor to provide fee credits in the event of failures to meet the availability commitment, that 99.9 or 99.5% time. What does that look like? I've included in contracts 3 strikes or death by 1,000 cuts termination rights. That if they are just failing to meet the availability commitment on a consistent basis, on 3 separate occasions during a 2-month period, you're going to have a breach. Or they're death by 1,000 cuts. You're getting multiple times in a given quarterly period where they're down. Your uptime commitment is not being met. And you'll be entitled to terminate and receive at least a prorated refund of the unused fees that were paid in advance. What about application performance warranty? Typically, your SaaS application will perform in all material respects, or substantially, that's another term I've seen, in accordance with its applicable specs or documentation. Remember, we went back to the application features are usually in a very technical product documentation format or record. Sometimes without limitation at the time when the customer is paying. Sometimes the SaaS application will be without limitation if there's an annual subscription. The remedy for breach then is really quite limited. Termination of the agreement. That's not satisfactory to most of our clients. Termination of the agreement if the application's performance does not meet the warranty and the vendor cannot correct it. We don't want to get to that point. We know that adoption, even though these systems and these are meant to be adopted quickly, installed quickly, and up and running very quickly, having to change and having to train individuals, your end users, your employees on a whole new system because you have to terminate the agreement because the application wasn't performing is not fun and not something we prefer to do. So what do we do in those cases? Well, we want to negotiate a prorated refund, or try to, where there's an unused portion of the subscription license fee for the remainder of the term or the service period. That's prorated back, and a refund for a portion of the fees that were paid prior to termination. They're going to try to limit the warranty, of course, to some period of time, and this is negotiable, some period of time after either the commencement of the agreement or after discovery of the application's defects, and 90 days is typical and reasonable. But hopefully, I want to preface this application warranty negotiations, hopefully you're getting some sort of dedicated desktop service where they're able to fix the application quickly and easily, and that's more likely what you're going to see. Most of the vendors don't want to see their applications failing. They're going to provide a fix, an update, a patch as quickly as possible, especially large account resellers. This is where customer service is key and so important, that the applications have to work. Your end users want to see their emails working. They want to see the emails come in and go out. If that's the minimum is not working, then you need to have a desktop support. You need to have that type of service in the service level agreement clearly stated that they're going to be available and working for you. What are you paying the subscription fees for? Should be some sort of support. Some more points on this is obtain the right to a refund. Of course, you should, of at least the entire service period's fees, if not more. And like I said, there is hardship and expense associated with having to research, select, and switch to an alternate vendor. There should be a price for that. And expanding the overall maximum liability to the total amount paid over the contract period is totally possible and common in traditional installed software license agreements. But again, these are worst-case scenarios related to the applications themselves, the application warranty negotiations. You hopefully will have support from your large account reseller or your vendor to help you get through any application problems. But the application is the minimum service you need and want. They should be jumping up and helping you out as quickly as possible related to those things. That concludes the content portion. I'm available to answer questions about 13 minutes or so. I know it's lunch hour, and we went through it fairly quickly, but I'm here to answer and help out with the Q&A, and I'll still thinking about it. I think. Well, a copy of these slides be made available. Stephanie?
They will. A copy of the PowerPoint and a link to download the recording, as well as MCLE certificates for those who need it, will be distributed early next week, about Tuesday or Wednesday, given the holiday.
And again, disclaimer, not to provide legal advice. Again, just best practices and observations. From my experience, negotiating, reviewing these types of agreements in the last, I want to say, 12 months. And it's been that quick. I wish I had some music to play you right now. Seeing no questions, do they have my email address? I think it's on the next slide. Oh, here we go. The negotiation of the contracts for SLA, liability for breach, can that be negotiated with Microsoft directly? The answer is generally, I have not seen that as no. You're negotiating directly with the reseller, and they're going to be the ones who have some ability to make changes, or they're the ones who, they have to make changes if that's what you're demanding that they do. You're welcome regarding the presentation. Are you aware of breaches from commercial cloud providers? As of now, I am not aware of breaches from commercial cloud providers. My clients have not had or seen that so far. The breaches I've seen have been because of a bankruptcy and inability to perform on the contract because of the bankruptcy, and then having to negotiate with a new vendor. How long does a public agency have to provide notice of breach to the affected parties? I've seen that depend on the contract. In the situation I talked about related to death by 1,000 cuts, breach notice was provided. We had a 30-day notice requirement, and then In that particular provision, we actually noticed them immediately after we, within the quarter, we saw that the commitments, the uptime commitment was failing, and we notified them. We continued to notify them multiple times, and then we notified them under the contract within that 30-day period. But hopefully you're providing them notice that, hey, we're having problems with the uptime, fix it. Oh, this is the second or third time in the last 4 months that we've had an uptime problem, need to be fixed. So we've been providing them notice the entire time. Should we include requirements regarding business continuity and disaster recovery? I think the answer is yes regarding disaster recovery, and requirements as in require that they provide service within a X amount of period of time. If a disaster occurs, how much time do we require them to make a recovery? I've seen up to 7 days that it needs to be recovered, or up to 5 days. I have not seen sort of the business continuity requirement drafted in. In your experience, do most public agencies have their own standard SaaS agreement? No. That is what I've not seen. I've been negotiating more often than not back on the SaaS agreements that I've received, more often than not because the IT department, they've been the ones on the front end vetting, doing the due diligence on the SaaS provider, on the SaaS contract reseller or the large account reseller, the vendor, and then they bring the contract to me and say, we're pretty far down the line, take a look at the contract. That's been more of my experience, and I just haven't had the time to create a SaaS contract. Let me see. Is it necessary to say it is a fully paid up royalty-free license? Is it necessary to say it is a fully paid up royalty-free license? I think it's a good idea to. I think it's important that it should be said that it's a royalty-free license and that it's been paid. So yeah, I think it's important to do so, and you should do so. Is it necessary? Yeah, pretty much. And it's important to make sure that it's clear that it's been fully paid and that you have a royalty-free license. With respect to breach of data by hackers, what is the time period for providing notice to those whose data is affected? My understanding, going back to 1798.29, the California Civil Code, it's as soon as you know. That's my understanding. As soon as can be reasonably made, you have to provide the notice of breach, subject to law enforcement purposes if there's an investigation going on. But it needs to be done as soon as possible. Any recommendation on levels of cyber liability coverage? I've seen at a minimum 500,000 up to 2 million, but a minimum of 500. Again, how long does the agency have to give notice of a data breach to the AG? It needs to be instantaneous to the Californians or the over 500 Californians that were affected also. And again, the data breach notification needs to be done as soon as possible, subject to law enforcement's needs. And that means that if there's some sort of investigation where you can't make the notification of data breach because they may be in the process of investigating and possibly catching who the hacker or the party that's attacking the information or getting the information, I think that's the only situation where you maybe wouldn't do a data breach notification. Otherwise, it needs to be done as soon as possible. Is it okay that the contract states that it disclaims the terms of the UN Convention on Contracts or the international sale of goods? That is a great question that I don't know the answer to at this point in time, but I'll be happy to review that and get back to you, Janet. I haven't run across it myself. And again, any recommendation on levels of cyber liability coverage, I've seen as low, and the lowest was 500,000 up to 2 million. Again, cyber liability coverage, so important, and that three-pronged approach of indemnification, cyber liability coverage, additional insured coverage, additional insured endorsement. Great questions. And Janet, I will get back to you. Where are the audit standards you quoted available for review? I can send that to you as well, Mr. Ortiz. I can email that to the group. I'll email that to Stephanie. Is that possible, Stephanie, to get that out to the participants?
Yes, of course.
Absolutely. So I'll get that out to everybody. happy to take any other questions. Hopefully, my information is available. Let me advance the slide. There I am. There's my email address. You can reach me, of course, at Myers-Navi's main line. And happy to help. And good luck out there negotiating these contracts, reviewing them, and pushing back to the extent you can. Happy to help out and provide and talk about strategy if you like. And here's my contact information. I don't see any other questions out there, so thank you very much for your attendance and participation. And it's been a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone. Again, just a reminder, we will circulate all the information and materials from today, as well as the link to the PowerPoint. And keep your eyes out for the next series to this subject. Have a great day.